Thank you. Y'all keeping cool enough there? The sun's getting a little bit warm, but the sun is shining on our efforts today. Well, it's a great honor to be here, and it's also a pleasure not to be speaking about voter fraud today, since as many of you know, that in my campaign for Secretary of State, that's what I've been talking about. But I want to talk about the Second Amendment, which is one of my favorite parts of the U.S. Constitution, and of course something that I teach when I teach constitutional law at UMKC Law School. I'm going to talk briefly about the origins of the Second Amendment, where it came from, what it meant to the Founding Fathers, because we need to re-inform ourselves today about where the starting point was in the Second Amendment, and then I'll briefly touch upon where we are today. You know, the origins of the Second Amendment actually did not start in America, but started in England. During various periods of violence in England, the Crown would attempt to disarm the citizens. And in 1689, following the English Civil War, the so-called Convention Parliament convened. And the Convention Parliament would restore the throne. The delegates in Parliament would agree to restore the throne by declaring William of Orange and James II's daughter Mary King and Queen of England. But as part of the deal, they insisted that the Crown recognize 13 indubitable rights retained by Englishmen. And that was part of a quid pro quo, if you will, for restoring the Crown in England. And among these rights was one declaring that, quote, the subjects which are Protestant may have arms for their own defense, end quote. It's important to note that the Convention Parliament rejected the alternative phrasing for their common defense. They said for their own defense. Well, then let's fast forward a little bit in history. The American colonies, of course, were already well underway. And in the 1760s, William Blackstone published one of the most important writings on English law ever, really, up until that point. And it was published in seriatim between 1765 and 1769, and it was his commentaries on the laws of England. And again, we have a clue as to what the historical meaning of the right to bear arms was in England. Now, these commentaries by Blackstone were an instant success in America. They were the equivalent of a national bestseller. 2,500 copies were sold in that period up until 1775. So they were informing the Americans who would soon be declaring their rights in the Declaration of Independence and pointing out how the king had violated their common law rights. But this is what Blackstone said about the English common law right to bear arms. He said the right of the people to be armed is what he called an auxiliary right that would, quote, protect and maintain inviolate the three primary rights of personal security, personal liberty, and private property, end quote. It's an auxiliary right. Our private property is not secure. Our other liberties, including our liberty of free speech and free exercise of religion, are not secure unless we have the auxiliary rights to back them up. He also said this, and this is quite interesting. He said, quote, in a land of liberty, it is extremely dangerous to make a distinct order of the profession of arms, end quote. And of course, that was what we saw and what they saw in so many of the monarchies of Europe at the time, that the order of the ownership of arms was essentially the aristocracy, and that a militia of the people, where the defense of the nation was something that the common people were expected and required to do, was a foreign notion to some of the European monarchies. Rather, the aristocracy had a distinct order. They were the distinct order who were privileged to bear arms and protect the country. Well, he said that was wrong, and that a free republic certainly would not be limited by that fact. And we saw, as a result, many laws in the colonies before independence requiring colonists to bear arms, not just permitting them to bear arms, but requiring them to own arms. So let's fast forward to the debate in the first Congress. The Second Amendment was proposed by the first Congress in 1789. As you know, it was not part of the original Constitution. It was part of our Bill of Rights. The debates in the first Congress are extremely revealing about what the original understanding of the Second Amendment was. So let's look at what Noah Webster stated. He said the following about the proposed Second Amendment. Quote, before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in about every kingdom of Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce just laws by the sword, because the whole body of people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops that can be raised in the United States, end quote. George Mason of Virginia He's a founding father that we don't talk about as much today. I guess he didn't have a series of publicists after his death that did as good a job as, say, with Madison and Adams and others. But George Mason at the time was really someone who was a bigger figure even than Madison, and some would say even a more respected figure than Jefferson. Here's what George Mason said about the right to bear arms, and he said this before the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And remember, the Bill of Rights went to the ratifying conventions in the states the Virginia Ratifying Convention for the Constitution itself, I'm sorry. He said, quote, "To disarm the people, that was the best and most effectual way to enslave them, by totally disusing and neglecting the militia," end quote. That was in 1788, prior to Congress drafting the Second Amendment. Also, the Second Amendment was written, of course, by James Madison, and he was looking at what some of the state constitutions already had. The Virginia Declaration of Rights famously recognized the right to bear arms. The New Hampshire Constitution had a provision that said this: all men have a certain natural, effectual, and inherent rights, among which are the enjoying and defending of life and liberty. Well, the meaning of the Second Amendment was quite clear to the framers. They saw it as a way of protecting themselves and a way of protecting the country against a tyrannical government, as well as protecting the country against foreign invaders. But I want to pause briefly to what James Madison originally wrote. James Madison was a famous self-editor. He would draft provisions of the Constitution both in 1787 and in the first Congress of 1789, and he would draft a longer version, and then he would shorten his words. He was constantly editing his words down to get the words crisper and more concise. Well, this is what his original version of the Second Amendment, this is how it read. Quote, "A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but no person religiously scrupled shall be compelled to bear arms," end quote. There are two really illuminating aspects of the original version. One is he said, the militia is not some special order. The militia is everybody. All people constitute the militia, and therefore all people have the individual right to bear arms. He also anticipated that it would be perfectly permissible for some former colonies, now states, to continue requiring people to bear arms. That was the understanding of our founding fathers. I want to give you a couple more snippets from the founding era, just to give you a sense of what they were thinking. Now, the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention in 1788, ratifying the original Constitution, was one of the conventions that insisted that in order to, as part of the deal for accepting this new Constitution, that the first Congress must propose a Bill of Rights. And they said specifically they wanted a Bill of Rights bill that included the right to bear arms, phrased as follows. Quote, "That the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and their own state or the United States, or for the purpose of killing game," end quote. As a hunter, I particularly like that reference to killing game. One of my favorite statements from the framers comes from Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson, of course, penned the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't present at the framing convention in 1787, but of course he was a huge figure in the early years of our republic. This is what he said, and this is not so much about the meaning of the Second Amendment, but about the importance of bearing arms to him as a person. He said this in a letter to Peter Carr in 1785. Peter was a friend of his, and he was just giving him personal advice on how to live your life. And I love this quote. Some of you may have heard it before. He said the following, quote, "A strong body makes the mind strong. As to the species of exercise, I advise the gun. While this gives a moderate exercise to the body, it gives boldness, enterprise, and independence to the mind. Games played with the ball and others of that nature are too violent for the body and stamp no character on the mind. Let your gun, therefore, be your constant companion of your walks," end quote. Good advice, although I think ball games are okay too. But Thomas Jefferson, an instrumental and one of the most influential founding fathers, saying, you know, best exercise, go take a walk with